On the evening of October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles and his troupe went on the air to say that Martians had invaded New Jersey. The War of the Worlds was a Halloween episode of the radio series, The Mercury Theater on the Air, directed by H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds. It was performed and broadcasted live at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on October 30th, 1938 over the CBS radio network. The episode is famous for inciting a panic by convincing some members of the listening audience that a Martian invasion was taking place, though the scale of panic is disputed, as the program had relatively few listeners. The episode begins with an introductory monologue based closely on the opening of the original novel, after which the program takes on the formal format of typical radio programming, being periodically by news bulletins. The first few bulletins interrupt a program of live music and are relatively calm reports of unusual explosions on Mars, followed by a seemingly unrelated report of an unknown object falling on a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. The crisis escalates dramatically when a correspondent reporting live from Grover's Mill describes creatures emerging from what is evidently an alien spacecraft. When local officials approach the aliens waving a flag of truce, the monsters respond by incinerating them and others nearby with a heat ray, which the on-scene reporter describes in a panic until the audio feed abruptly goes dead. This is followed by a rapid series of news updates detailing the beginning of a devastating alien invasion and the military's futile efforts to stop it. The first portion of the episode climaxes with another live report from the rooftop of a Manhattan radio station. The correspondent describes crowds fleeing clouds of poison smoke released by Martian war machines and dropping like flies as the gas approaches his location. Eventually he coughs and falls silent, and a lone ham radio operator asks, "Is there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone?" With no response, the program takes its first break 30 minutes after Wells's introduction. The second portion of the show shifts to a conventional radio drama that follows a survivor dealing with the aftermath of the invasion and the ongoing Martian occupation of Earth. The final segments last for about 16 minutes, and like the original novel, concludes with the revelation that the Martians have been defeated by microbes rather than humans. The broadcast ends with a brief out-of-character announcement by Wells in which he compares the show to dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Wells's War of the Worlds broadcast has become famous for convincing some of its listeners that a Martian invasion was actually taking place due to the breaking news style of storytelling employed in the first half of the show. The illusion of realism was supported by the Mercury Theater on the Air's lack of commercial interruptions, which meant that the first break in the drama came after all of the alarming news reports had taken place. Popular legend holds that some of the radio audience may have been listening to the Chase and Sanborn Hour with Edgar Burgeon and tuned into the War of the Worlds during a musical interlude, thereby missing the clear introduction indicating that the show was a world of science fiction. In the days after the adaptation, widespread outrage was expressed in the media. The program's news bulletin format was described as deceptive by some newspapers and public figures, leading to an outcry against the broadcasters and calls for regulation by the FCC. Wells apologized at a hastily called news conference the next morning, and no punitive action was taken. The broadcast and subsequent publicity brought the 23-year-old Wells to the attention of the general public and gave him the reputation of an innovative storyteller and trickster. People love telling the story of their fellow Americans who fell for the Halloween trick. It's used as an example of how gullible the public is, how fearful everyone was of what was happening in Europe at the time, how mass hysteria is created through the media. These days, it's fun to see it as an example of fake news. Trouble is, it didn't happen that way. Reading the first part of Cattrall's book, The Invasion from Mars, A Study in the Psychology of Panic, he is very clear, although the publisher says 1 million were infected with terror, and he says thousands at the beginning of the book. He is quick to note that his sample of sizes of interviewees was 153, 2/3 of whom were self-selected from people who said they panicked. Every so often, the panic myth is revived. The Library of Congress has an article on how panic didn't happen, and there are other places on the web where one can find some debunking. But as the Asked article points out, when the tale is kept alive, it's hard to get the truth in there. A current article explores the faith people have in their own trusted sources, in the context of the panic. It's a good article, but it seems to assume the panic really happened. Why did the myth take off in the first place? One reason is that Orson Welles was a wonderful publicity hound who encouraged it. Another is that his sold newspapers. Radio competed with print for people's attention, so the papers were happy to blame the broadcaster and Welles for being irresponsible. Of more interest is what happened in 1940, when both Orson Welles and H.G. Wells were in San Antonio, and recorded a radio program together. 2 years before, when asked about his book and the panic in America, Wells had reportedly been firm that he had not authorized the radio network to change place names. 2 years later, he considered the radio show had just been a hoax, but he said that Americans could have their fun because you haven't got the war right under your chins. Although the double interview is awkward at the beginning, by the end both Wells and Wells are clear that alienating Russia, despite its autocratic government under Stalin, would not be a good idea. There's an interesting historical pattern to the popularity of both Wells' novel and Wells' radio show. In 1898, there were small wars in a number of places, interests in eugenics, and a fascination with space and Mars in particular. In 1938, war was about to begin in Europe, and Germany was on the move. Hollywood made a major motion picture of War of the Worlds in 1953, and Cattrall's book was reprinted in 1954 during the Carlism. The 1970s saw another revival, at a time of hijackings and terrorism, and now again when reality TV, extremism in pop culture, the decline of civil society, and a gullible public are current issues, the story is here again.